I'm going to talk about how we can leverage the complete Ember tool build today to make things better for all of the community. And that's, I think there are two parts to the talk. One is something that has actual practical value for most or many of you. And the second part is an example for how we benefit from what we have with our conventions-based ecosystem and our common build system, which is Ember CLI. So my name is Marco. We heard all that already. I run SimpLabs and a European engineering consultancy. We're based in Munich. We help clients build things with this stack here, also do trainings. And one thing that I want to say is, well, we also help organize Emberfest, which is happening in Berlin this year, October 12th and 13th. So that's a non-profit community event organized by several parties from the European Ember community. We are one of those parties. So if you feel there's room for a second Ember conference in your year, then you're invited to come. You can find all the information on emberfest.eu. The CFP is still open until end of August. So if you have something to share, please submit. Just don't expect immediate response. Might take a few weeks. As I said, I'm going to talk about an example for how we all benefit from what we have with Ember CLI and all the power that it brings with it. And the example is a problem that we all face or have faced. And then I'm going to show how we solve that problem for the community by taking advantage of the complete tool build. And that problem is, how do we identify DOM elements in acceptance or integration tests? Because obviously we need to identify elements so we can find them in the render DOM tree, let's say, of component, in the case of component integration test, and then assert on the state of that element. And state might be just present, like if state is A, then I expect this to be rendered. Or might be presence of a class on an element, or might be whether a text field is enabled or disabled or whatever. Probably most of you have asked this question. And I want to show an example here. So here we have a component that runs a blog post, like the standard component example, so to say. So we render the title into the H1 and the body and the P tag. And obviously we want to render that we want to test that the blog post is rendered correctly in the integration test. And because we're smart, most of us would come up with a smart plan to do so. And that might look something like this. We just select elements by their tag name. So we select the H1 and assert that contains the post title, and then we select the P and assert that contains the post body. So we keep things simple. We just use what's in the DOM and just identify that and assert on the presence of some text. And that works well, obviously, until this change happens. Which is a purely stylistic change, which doesn't break any functionality, and thus, of course, it should not break the test. But, of course, it does, right? And then we all have our little Theresa May moment as we realize that our smart plan failed and things didn't work out as expected. So we have another idea then. We can just use classes to identify elements in the nose in the DOM from test. And we prefix the class with JS here to make the intention of the class clear. So that's going to be used from JavaScript land and not intended for styling. So that way we can decouple the selectors that we will be using in the test from the actual DOM nodes, as we can apply those classes to any element, really. And then we would change our test to look like this. So instead of using the tag name as a selector, here we use the class name JSPostTitle to select the element containing the title, and then JSPostBody to select the element containing the body. The good thing about this here, the added advantage kind of, is that we also add some semantics to the test selectors. So while it was previously a bit unclear which elements we selected because we just used the tag names, now it's a bit clearer what we select because it's pretty clear that JSPostTitle will probably contain the post title, right? So that works well, of course, and is also more robust because if we have a change like this, we change H2 to div and P to div, but we keep the JSPost classes, this will not break the test. But then eventually somebody does this. So now the things that we use in the test and the things that we use for styling are mixed, which is not ideal, of course. And then probably once this happened, then it wouldn't take long until this happens. Like the designer decides to refactor the styles a bit, rename the class, because that's just a styling change. So your designer now broke the tests, which is something that you don't want to happen, of course. Another problem with this is that it's pretty hard to add additional data to those classes. So here we add the post ID to the class, so we can assert on a specific post being present in the DOM tree and wouldn't have to use the title for that. But if we want to get that ID back in the template, we have to pass the class name, and it's just all very cumbersome and very brittle. So again, it turns out that our smart plan failed, and things are now worse than before. But there's hope, at least for us. We can just use data attributes, because data attributes were basically made for that. They're a mechanism to attach custom data to any element in the DOM tree, really. So here, instead of using class names, we just tag the elements with data attributes using data test, or using the data test prefix just as a convention. So we make clear that those data attributes are meant for testing. And then we change our test to look like this. So instead of using class names as selectors, we use attribute selectors, which basically just means you use those square brackets, and that means like you're selecting anything that has that attribute. You could also select elements that have this attribute with a particular value. Like actually, attribute selectors are pretty powerful, but here we just select anything that has this attribute. So we select the title and assert on its inner text, and then we select the body and assert on that inner text. So it's still pretty straightforward. We still have maintained the semantics in the selector. So like just by looking at the selector, it's still clear what we select. And it's also easy to add additional data to elements in the DOM. So here we can just assign the post ID to the data attribute, and then later just read the value for that data attribute to get the ID back in the test, which is obviously much nicer than having to pass the class name. So we use this approach all the time and have been doing so for a few months or so, maybe a year, half a year or so. And it works really well for us, which is why we built an add-on to make the whole concept a bit more powerful and convenient for people, and that's called Ember test selectors. I want to show some examples for how Ember test selectors makes things more convenient. First example is this. So here we add a data attribute to a component that we render, assigning the post ID as a value, and this will add the data test attribute to the component's root element without you having to specify data attribute bindings, because we auto-bind anything that starts with data test dash to the component instance, so you don't have to do it. You just add it in your template, and then it will work as expected. Or you could also, if you prefer that, define the property in the component's JavaScript, and that would also be auto-bound. For the second thing that Ember test selectors does, I want to bring something up that you might have wondered about already. Like maybe you're seeing a more fundamental problem with the general approach, which is that we now have those data test attributes everywhere in our DOM tree. So we increase the bundle size, although those things will certainly never be used in production because they're only used for tests, right? So it seems pointless to ship them to all of our users. You might have a lot of these data test attributes, depending on how much you test and how much detail you test. And you also have all these useless data test properties in your JavaScript code if you use that approach. The good thing is, though, that we have you covered, because we turn this into this for production, and we turn this into this, and we turn this into this. So that you never ship any of these data test attributes to any users, because for production builds, we would just remove them from both JavaScript and handlebars. All while keeping the convenience of the approach in general, where you can just apply data test attributes to anything that you render and use them to identify things in your test. Like I said, this stripping is enabled for production by default. You can also configure that to be switched off for production if you prefer that, or if you want to test your production build, which might be a good idea. But by default, we just switch it on for production because that's what most of the people would probably want to have. So the question that comes up, how does it all work? And this is actually pretty easy because this is all you have to do. You just install the add-on, and without any configuration, it just works as you would expect. So that might be it, actually, because that's all you have to know, right? Obviously, there's more. But the point is that all you have to know, it will work out of the box, and that's basically only possible because we have this common build system, which is Ember CLI, and we know where to hook in, so to make it work out of the box for everyone. So now comes the advanced part of the talk, where I talk about how this all works internally. You don't really have to know that because, like I said, the nice thing is you only install the add-on, but it's still an interesting thing, of course, to see how these things actually work under the hood. So first of all, auto binding of data attributes that I showed you. How does that work? So how do we make sure that data test post ID will actually be put on the component's root element without you having to configure the data attribute bindings manually. So actually, it's quite simple. We just patch Ember component. So on every build, we inject this snippet here into your application, which in the case that which just like does the auto binding so you don't have to do anything. And the actual auto binding is a bit complex because we have to handle all kinds of edge cases, so I'm leaving that out here. But the point is that just by installing this add-on, we can inject this into your application and it will just work out of the box. Obviously, this is only necessary for development and test, though not for production. So we don't always do it, but we only do it when we are not stripping. This underscore strip test selectors is our internal state that tracks whether we actually want to remove all test selectors or keep them in. It would be true if we're building a build for production. The included method that you see here is defined on the add-on and is invoked by Ember CLI on any build when the build is on any build when the add-on is added to the build or included in the build, right? Like that's why it's called included. And this is generally the method where you want to like inject code or do other things that have to happen during the build. By not injecting that in the case that we're stripping attributes, so AKA production kind of, we make sure we don't add an unnecessary weight to a production bundle, and also don't inject something that has a runtime overhead, which the auto binding obviously has. But we still have all those properties in the JavaScript code if you use them. Although we now know for sure that they won't be used because we don't auto-bind them anymore, so there's no point to keep them. And we should strip them as well. And for that, we can leverage Babel. So here, this is a different part of the included method. And again, only when we are stripping, so removing all data test attributes depending on the Babel version, because now, since few weeks or a month ago, as Ember CLI supports both Babel 5 and 6, we have to like be prepared for both cases here. So we, depending on the Babel version, we either add a plugin for Babel 5 or Babel 6. And the plugin itself is actually pretty simple. It looks like this. You return a visitor, and then you just, in that visitor, you just implement all the methods for all the AST nodes that you care about, basically. In our case, we only care about properties, obviously, because properties are the only thing that could potentially be removed by this. Like, we would never remove a method or so, because that would, like, that could never be auto-bound anyway. And then if the name starts with data test dash, we just remove the whole thing. A side note here, Ingrid already showed that earlier. If you work with ASTs of any kind, you want to use the ASTExplorer.net. It's like an awesome visualization tool, which even allows you to run transforms. It supports JavaScript and handlebars and like lots of other things, and it's actually pretty cool. So here's an example. We have some source code in the top left, and then on the top right you see the AST. In the bottom left we have a simple transform which basically just reverses the names of everything, and then at the bottom right you see the output of that. Right? Obviously it wouldn't work because there's no ALOS knock, right? But you get the idea. So the workflow is usually you write most of your stuff in ASTExplorer.net and then just copy it over to your JavaScript files and save it in your project. So now we have the JavaScript cleaned up. We don't ship anything that's not necessary on production, but what about the templates? We still have these here that should be removed as well. So we just register another transform, and in this case, that's for the handlebars AST. So again, different part of the included method of the add-on. When we are stripping, so when we are removing data test attributes, then we register the HTML bars AST plugin. I have to inject a warning here because what I'm going to show you is not public API, and you should probably not use that, but it might be still interesting to see how the approach works in general. And it's, again, relatively easy, actually. So we just have to make sure we handle some different cases. So the first case is that the node type is an element node, and that basically means it's a like normal HTML element in your template. And what we do in that case is we just filter the node's attributes and remove everything that is a test selector, which means starts with data test dash, and then we just replace the attributes of that node with the filtered attributes. So see, pretty straightforward. So now we replace replace this with this. So everything that shouldn't go to production has been stripped out. Obviously, this runs before the Glimmer compilation. So this is not what will actually be shipped to the user, of course, but what's not in the source template will also not be compiled into Glimmer's wire format, obviously, so it's actually relevant to filter that out, of course. But there's more that we need to strip. So we have to handle two other cases as well. So the second case here is for mustache statements and block statements. Mustache statement is the non-block invocation of a component, and block statement is the block form invocation of a component, basically. And what we do here is first for all the params, which I believe are the positional params, we just do the same filtering that we did above, just remove everything that is a test selector and then reassign the params with a filtered list. So we turn this into this. So another step. And then the last case that we need to handle is components attributes, which again works the same way. The only difference is here we have a pair, or we have an array of key value pairs, because attribute obviously has a key and a value. And if the key is a test selector, we just remove the whole thing, regardless of the value, of course. And then we replace the attributes as in the previous example. So we now turn this into this, and we're done. We remove everything that you only need for testing. So there's no unnecessary weight or runtime performance overhead in the production bundle that you're building. And you still keep all the convenience of the data attributes approach in general without having to do anything, without having to configure anything, and that's all you thanks to Ember CLI. That's a great screencast. For more info on Ember test selectors that EmberMap released like some weeks or months ago, so you should probably watch it if you're interested in using Ember test selectors. At the end, I want to briefly talk about Glimmer, because we have heard so much about Glimmer, and it's pretty cool. And Ember test selectors does not actually support Glimmer. I just verified that today. So if you want to help, then you're welcome to step in. Here's the issue. Basically, we just have to do a few things. So, for example, patching Ember component is pointless when you're building Glimmer app. And auto attribute bindings are pointless anyway because such a concept doesn't even exist in Glimmer. And we have to do a few other things. So if you want to help with it, that would be great. And now that's it for you this time. Thanks.